My speech today is going to be about oil, pretty obvious. We're going to learn today about why the world can't live without this black substance. I mean, we hear all the time in the news, oil price this, oil price that. What's the big deal? So that's the purpose of today's speech. Why is oil so important? What's the cost of our dependence on oil? And what the future can look like. So let's begin. Can we live without fossil fuels like oil? At today's time, it's hard to think of a world without fossil fuels, but history can give us an idea of what the world looked like without this black gold. The world basically depended on energy sources like wood, dung, as well as whale oil, if you will believe that or not, for energy sources. And this is what the world depended on for pretty much since mankind began, until this happened. Oops. Which was the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania in 1858. This changed everything. This propelled us from an agrarian society, horses, farms, things like that, into 150 years later, into the world of planes, steel buildings, the infrastructure we depend on and enjoy today. So let's review. When we think of oil, we think of fuel. That's pretty much the biggest use of oil. And it takes about 1 barrel of crude to fill up this car. When I say 1 barrel of crude, I'm talking about the oil right out of the ground before it gets processed, before anything happens to it. It basically gets refined, gets through a process, and then ends up in the gas stations that we go to. And it takes about 1 barrel to fill up this car. However, what's very interesting is to fill up one Boeing 737, it takes over 1,719 barrels of crude. This is just oil that's refined, goes through all the process, and it turns into jet fuel. And what's even more interesting, after all that consumption of oil, a jet fuel only lasts 12 months before it expires. Just something to think about. And other than the common sources of transportation that we depend on, oil is actually used in everything, from ice creams to shortenings to oils that we use to cook, to makeup, to medicines. All of those items that we use every day depend on oil. Oil is a part of every single one of those components of our everyday lives. It's actually interesting. I can honestly say there hasn't been a day in my life where I haven't benefited from oil, because really I can't go anywhere without running into it in all these different products. However, our enjoyment of oil, what oil has created for us in terms of a better life, in terms of a better infrastructure in the United States, it comes at a cost. And that cost is basically the environment. A good example of this, and a popular example, is the BP oil spill. One mistake, and even today, the environment on the Gulf Coast is still paying for it. This is an example of our overdependence on oil leads to cutting corners, and those cutting corners have an extremely high cost to them. Can we find a better way? What do we know? We know oil is key to our everyday life. However, we know it has a huge cost on the environment, and the pollution is very extreme in different parts of the world. The most common alternatives that we know about are, the most common alternatives that we know about are solar, wind, nuclear, all of these new energy sources that, honestly, all of these new energy sources that we still use today. And in fact, more of the US global energy grid is depending more on solar, wind, and nuclear, which is fantastic. They're renewable energies and they're positive for the environment. However, they're not effective transport fuels. What does that mean? That means the solar, wind, the nuclear power, they can fuel our homes, they can fuel our offices, they can fuel our factories, but they're not effective in terms of how do I get my car from point A to point B? How do I get my boat from China to Europe? They're not effective in those regards. So that's why even today, 100+ years after the discovery of oil, we still depend on it more and more. However, things have changed. Now, innovative American oil companies have found a way in where oil can benefit the environment and we can still enjoy it. What that means is basically CO2. CO2 is a compound in the air that's not good. It's produced from pollution. It's overall not good for the environment. And in fact, these oil companies in West Texas have found a way in where they can capture the CO2 from the air and utilize it in a way where they can generate more and more oil from the ground. What does that mean? That means we can increase our profit margins while at the same time protecting the environment. Lastly, this is a quick overview of how it works. So we get the CO2 from the air, we pump it into the ground along with some water and other materials, and that allows us to get more oil from the shale rocks than we would have otherwise had, and then recovery, and we sell it. So enhanced oil recovery is what they call it. In conclusion, oil seems like it's going to be here to stay until we find an alternative, but the methods of enhanced oil recovery will only increase because it allows oil companies to save the environment and earn more profits. Lastly, I hope you learned something interesting, and thank you for listening.